Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Randy Zimmerman, and I want to introduce you to my new channel that I am calling Zim Geek. And on this channel, I want to cover every aspect of comics and sequential art. Now, the first thing I'm sure you're asking yourself is, why should I listen to this old dog? Well, that's precisely why you should listen to me, because I am an old dog. I have been around quite a lot and been inside of comics and have seen a lot of different things, so much so that I've decided I need to do this channel in order to tell you about it. And this is where the geek part of the Zim Geek channel is going to kick in, because I want to talk about absolutely every aspect of comics, cartoons, sequential art, every little corner, every little detail, and I want to do it in the most fun and entertaining way possible. And I think the very best way to do that is to show you comics from my own unique perspective. Now, I know a lot of you have never heard of me before, so let me tell you a bit about myself. I was raised in a very small town in the middle of Michigan, about 20 minutes or so north of Flint. Not quite this long ago, at least after these streets were paved. But hey, still, no cable or internet, and only 4 channels on the television. On top of that, I was raised in a strict religious household who believed that superhero comics were too violent, even back then. Despite all that, comics had still grabbed my interest, and I still wanted to learn everything that I could about comics and sequential art, and that meant getting to know all of the superheroes that I could possibly get my hands on. So, daily trips to the library when I usually walked home from school. And speaking of school, this was during a time when comics were not even remotely considered to be cool. So on top of the religion, the passion that I had for comics and learning how to draw them added to me being quite a loner in school. Luckily, I had a couple of outs. Because of my drawing ability, during my junior and senior year, I was able to go half the day to the Genesee Area Skill Center, which was a technical school where I went for commercial art and learned all of the fantastic tools a graphic artist would use back then. Unfortunately, the computer replaced every last one of them. Also, during the last 2 years of school, I had a job in Flint at a hardware store, which gave me some extra mobility and some money. So I ended up spending that on a lot of extra comics and actually discovering the direct market during that time. But we'll talk about that in another video. And also by that time, my parents had backed down about me buying superhero comics. And we'll discuss that one in another video too. That's a whole nother story that I'm sure you'll be interested to hear. Soon after graduating high school, I got a job at a pinball arcade. And in the back of that arcade, I opened up the first comic shop in Genesee County that I called Trilogy Books. But I still couldn't get the love of making comics out of my blood. Soon after that, I got married and settled down and had a daughter. But my passion for comics still raged on. In fact, designing my first comic story and getting it printed was probably a key factor in my getting a divorce. Getting a divorce is always a transition time for anybody. But for me, I ended up losing my job at the bookstore and turning down a job as an intern at Marvel, where when I found out how much it paid, I literally laughed in the guy who offered it to me's face. So that was a really good bridge burned. Not the first or the last one in my instance. Like I said, I got a lot of stories. It was around this time I got involved with Ralph and Stu and Arrow Comics out of Ypsilanti. I was happy to help put together the first title for them, and I worked my way up to art director, answering letter columns and such. Then eventually I left there and began self-publishing on my own. Though I was working in comics, I was still not completely paying my bills. So in order to do that, I was working at comic shops here locally. After my divorce and a few failed relationships, I had kind of sworn off looking for anyone unless they were really into comics. So working in the comic shop, I eventually met and married my current wife. And this was happening all during a period in comics history known as the black and white bust. And even though I was going around doing all sorts of alternative projects for anybody that would allow me to work for them, I was still not making ends meet. So I ended up working in a local t-shirt shop, being their graphic arts department. That job lasted a good 10 years, and in fact I still use that printer today whenever I need any apparel printed from an outside client. Plus, that owner was so nice to me that he loaned me the money to print alternative comics while I was working for him on the condition that I repaid him with the first money I got back from the distributor. Even while I was self-publishing my own material, I was still freelancing for other companies, like the War of the Worlds series that I wrote for Caliber that lasted for 5 issues and is still listed in Overstreet Price Guide to this day. Then, with the help and investment from an old friend and retailer, we decided to restart Arrow Comics again, and we ran that for quite a few years during the 90s. This incarnation of Arrow Comics printed well over 50 different issues, and among those books that we printed was an opinionated little monkey that I drew myself named Spank. That was pretty popular when it first came out. Publishing these comics were a lot of fun and a very big learning experience, and there's a lot of stories that are associated with this. But the thing is, the reason we stopped printing was because of the distributor, Diamond, who was constantly changing their rules and making our numbers shrink, and then eventually telling us which titles we could and could not print. No matter how optimistic you are or how fun it is for you to publish, after you're constantly beaten down over and over again with new hoops, new rules, disappointing stories, and having to disappoint talent because of those shrinking numbers, you eventually just have to stop, and that's what we did. At this point, I decided I was done with the direct market. I just concentrated on paying my bills and getting by. So I concentrated on my commercial artwork and got a few extra clients, actually started my own apparel business along with a couple of friends, which didn't last for very long, but I still worked on doing comics and illustration work. In the early 2000s, I decided to try to work for mainstream comics again, dusted off a few proposals, and got lucky and was able to do San Diego for a few years in a row. Actually, I was a gopher for the great Bernie Wrightson. Imagine my disappointment when I was taking around these proposals for some favorite characters of mine, only to be met with blank stares from the editors. One of them even asked me flat out if they even owned the character, which he was not aware of at the time. One of the editors told me that these proposals were just for 3rd and 4th tier characters, and they weren't interested in resurrecting anything like that. And then I pointed out that Blade was a 3rd or 4th tier character until he had his recent movie. You should have seen the look on his face. I had always been attracted to the second banana, the unusual cartoon or comic characters. That's why history for me was so interesting, especially comics history. Also, during this time when I was pitching properties to the mainstream, there were a couple of editors there that I really respected. And in fact, I got very close to placing a property with Vertigo until that editor took it back up to Vertigo's chief, who dismissed it on the name alone. That was very disappointing. I really enjoyed that concept and still might do it someday. So at this point, I kind of stepped back again from comics and mainstream, decided to concentrate on my commercial work and my illustration work, but comics never really leaves your system once it gets into your blood. So about that time around in Flint, there was a new political alternative paper that sprung up called The Uncommon Sense. So once I saw it, I had to volunteer, and I quickly became their cartoon editor, supplying them with all sorts of different cartoons. And we even had a few special issues of the paper that were devoted to comics. And that really got me thinking. The paper was really only out about 3 or 4 years, but it had already planted a seed in the back of my mind. Why couldn't we do comics as a newspaper and get it out to people? So with the help of another longtime friend of mine that I've known back since the bookstore days, the two of us got together and started Flint Comics, a free-to-readers alternative newspaper filled with comics and stories and cartoons and all sorts of fun stuff to read. We would print 10,000 copies of this paper and just distribute them within the Flint area and get back a few hundred every month depending upon the season. Sometimes it was a little more, sometimes it was a little less. We would take the extras and do local conventions and just hand them out. Being advertiser supported, the paper always had a hard time breaking even. But when the Flint water crisis happened, it was even rougher as the mom and pop businesses' advertising budgets dried up. Forgive the pun. Even before the water crisis happened, there were months that we were struggling to make ends meet. And after many years of publishing, right around issue 56, I believe it was, my partner had decided that he had had enough, so he walked away from the paper. But for me, it was always a labor of love, so I just kept it going. And the paper is still coming out today, and we are very quickly closing in on our 100th issue. And there's so much more surrounding this paper that I want to talk to you about, especially our conventions that we hold once a year, the fact that we have red boxes all over the county, or that you can walk into a family restaurant and actually pick up a funny paper once a month. Well, now it's once every other month. But I'm running short on time here, and I still have a little bit more to go to talk to you about and to try to convince you to keep following me as I go through on this channel, which includes some of the commercial sequential art that I have done over the last few years, especially the Preservers, a team of superheroes I created with our local nature preserve to teach people about conservation and preservation. That team has caught on like wildfire here in the area and is getting some national attention as well, as we were featured in an episode of Treehouse Masters that ran on Animal Planet. In addition to all of that, I've also been teaching cartooning after school, mostly through latchkey programs all throughout the county for, wow, probably the last 12 to 14 years. I've really gotten it down to a system that I really want to show everybody. So it's another reason to have this channel and another reason to follow along. You want to learn how to cartoon? I can show you. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we need to discuss about comics. Different ages, different ways of production, different ways of doing things, the alternative market. There's so many different aspects, so many different ages here that comics have gone through that to me it's incredibly fascinating. And it's also a subject that's really not being covered enough as far as YouTube goes. And also, just as importantly, I really want to be a geek about this, no matter how silly that sounds. Because quite frankly, in my belief, this art form is so viable, and it definitely doesn't have enough cheerleaders, especially not anymore. As we all know, we recently lost comics' biggest cheerleader, Stan Lee, and here was a guy who stood up for comics over and over again, always had a positive attitude, always loved the art form, and hey, he might not have always wanted to be there, but he was there. He was the big promoter. He was the big pusher. And oh yeah, he got rich off of it. More power to him. So if there's one important thing that I've learned over the last 10 years of doing that newspaper, teaching those cartooning classes, and doing all this commercial work where I'm using sequential art to teach people and to advertise products, is that cartooning and comics are so vital and they're so viable, and they can also be so entertaining no matter what form it takes. It just has to be done right and done with a level of quality. And that's what I really want to promote on this channel. So I hope I've told you enough about what I want to do and to entice you along to keep following, keep looking for the different videos that I will be posting. I'll be trying to post as often as possible, though I can't really promise because obviously I got a lot of stuff going on, but I will do my best. I also want to thank you so much for listening to all of this, especially since this is my first attempt at learning this crazy software and trying to get all of the editing and all of the sound quality together. I'm sure there are glitches here, and I hope you'll forgive me for having them. The next video that I want to do is going to be a screen capture with the basic rules of cartooning, just to lay a little foundation there and to let you know where I'm coming from as far as cartooning goes. It's going to be a lot of fun to do. It'll be a lot of fun, even if you don't like cartooning. I hope you'll follow along with that as well. So if you like what you've heard so far and you want to hear more, first, I really appreciate your tolerance. Second, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you ring the bell for notifications. I will be posting more videos as soon as I possibly can, and I hope that you'll bear with me and be a geek just like I am. So thanks again, and take care. Most of all, thanks a lot for being here.